Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the penultimate session of our day-and-a-half-long conference on E.L. Mascall. It's my pleasure to introduce to you this afternoon our next two speakers, Father Philip Moller, who is the university's lecturer in modern Catholic theology and a fellow of Campion Hall, who's going to speak to us on E.L. Mascall, the theology of nature and the doctrine of grace. And as indicated yesterday, it's really thanks to a conversation with the King's Arms last year with Father Philip that we're all here today. He was the person who planted the seed of the idea of having a conference recovering Mascall in Oxford. And Father Philip will be followed by Father Robin Ward, who lots of you will know is the principal of St. Stephen's House, the premier theological institution on the County Road here in Oxford. Father Robin has a doctorate in patristics that teaches very widely and is going to speak to us this afternoon on Eric Mascall and the doctrine of the Church. Father Philip, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much, John, for inviting me here today, and we will see if I actually, having had an idea about Mascall, have got him at all right at all, and you will tell me afterwards. So we'll see. Now, as a student of the Roman Catholic tradition, I stepped this afternoon with some trepidation into the company and also the territory of experts in Anglican theology, and in the heart of Pusey Chapel, no less. No mean feat for someone like me. But I'm feeling brave enough to do so, because I have, since my Cambridge days, been intrigued by the categories that are used to describe Eric Mascall's work, precisely because they seem to map on to very similar parallel debates in the Roman and French Catholic churches in quite a similar time period. But in those cases, under the headers like the theology of nature and the theology of creation. Let me explain, not least because the slightly cryptic title of my remarks today runs E.L. Mascall, the theology of nature and the doctrine of grace, with an important question mark at the end. Now, we've heard in different presentations these days that Mascall presents arguments for a metaphysical realism in the arena of philosophy of religion, which was the substance of his major works during his Oxford years, appearing under the titles He Who Is, An Existential Analogy, the latter of which appeared as early as 1949. And of course, as we know, he gave the Gifford under the title The Openness of Being. But the question that I would like to put to you today is whether this is the full extent of his intellectual project, especially during the Oxford years of 1946 to 1962. Is it not possible, in light of what we've heard and what we've read, that Mascall is moving towards a more fully worked up theology of nature, or theology of creation, as well as a more subtle theology of grace, which he hints at as early as 1949 in a lesser-known article entitled Nature, Grace and Mysticism. Now, Mascall, as we know, is often understood to be working as a philosopher first, and this is why he starts with the metaphysical concept of being. Even in his more theological work, I think, Christ, the Christian and the Church in 1946, he opens by saying that beings in the plural, in the world, are themselves dependent realities. They do not have, and I quote, that independent and self-subsistent reality which is the peculiar property of God himself. Now, as a good Thomist, Mascall holds fast to the distinction from Lateran IV in 1215, that there is a radical difference of kind that distinguishes the Creator from even the most exalted of creatures. But then makes what I think is the most interesting turn by pointing to the Christian tradition, which argues that the human being is deified and is incorporated into Christ. That is, being, in some sense, is completed. But what is his methodology here? I'd like to advance this afternoon that one feature of the distinctiveness of his contribution in the Anglophone world is that Mascall knows that theological discourse is impossible without articulated ontological decisions. And that discourse must necessarily situate itself in relation to ontological or metaphysical decisions that are made within non-theological frames of reference. It's a complex mode of thought. Now, interestingly for our purposes, Mascall picks up the Greek tradition of the way of affirming the being of God and points to Origen's reliance on Exodus 3:14 to, and I quote, develop the notion of God's relationship to created beings as a relationship between the one who truly is, being capital B, to something that is, small b, being by participation. For him, the terminology of deification passes firmly and finally into the Christian tradition by the time of Origen, which is early. And resorting to the Eastern tradition, he argues for this is his term, a doctrine of grace that draws a fine line between full absorption into divine nature and certain Protestant views according to which a creature may never attain such participation. But is Mascall really talking about the doctrine of grace first? Or is he instead excavating a theology of creation or nature? Now, what Mascall means here is not overly clear, but it is clear from his line of argument that he's drawing from important Eastern sources and certainly arrives at a settled position on creature. Here, to trace the argument more carefully, we might be helped by the researchers of the French Jesuit Ressourcement tradition to flag my argument in advance. Henri de Lubac, with many of his Jesuit brothers from Lyon, especially those involved in the launching of the Sources Chrétiennes series, which will all be pretty familiar, I think, drew upon those sources to better understand the relation of being, with a capital B, beings, small b, and nature. And de Lubac in particular points to the fact, and quite rarely for his time, that it was left to Byzantine, and especially to Palamas, to specify the terms of a theory of participation, the God. And forgive me if I become still a little bit technical here. If the absolute future of man must be thought of under the figure of divinization, after Mascall, theosis, in accordance with 2 Peter 1:4, from which Mascall also derives his argument, then God, or at least his nature, or Pusis, must be open to the participation of creaturely beings. Importantly, in order to ensure that the doctrine of divinization does not undermine the doctrine of the divine transcendence, the transcendence of being itself, Pseudo-Dionysius proposes this paradoxical formula: God is the unshareable shared. And so by the time of Palamas was able to supply the already classic distinction, from the time of Basil in fact, between divine energies, that which is open to participation, the Dunamai of Pseudo-Dionysius, and essence which is not open to participation, the Hensenios of Pseudo-Dionysius, in order to provide a coherent solution to the problem. And so here we have the requirements of apophasis preserved, because the divine essence, or super-essence, remains strictly incomprehensible. But also the requirements of the ontology of the divine are also here preserved. What is brought here, and is noticed by both de Lubac, and I want to suggest also Mascall, is the development of an eschatological doctrine of the humanity of man, or the humanity of the human. And with it, the concept of divinization also makes it necessary to speak of a God who is, of God as being, that is a logical consequence. Being itself, with the qualification, of course, that if it was necessary to distinguish in God between essence and what is not essence, this is precisely because God is not limited by his essence. And here, de Lubac is stealing from Lossie, so I'm sure Bishop Rowan was on. To return to Mascall's argument, having now filled it out a little, we see that there is a subtle but definite transition from the metaphysical reflection on being and beings to the eschatological doctrine of humanity and man, which is now the arena of theology of creation, or maybe that of nature. Which is why he then criticizes the reformers for excluding any sort of deification whatsoever, before training his sights, his most important sights, on those Catholic neo-Thomists, by saying some of the Catholic manualists have stated the doctrine of grace and nature in a very pedestrian and uninspired way. I would like to admit him. For an Anglophone Thomist writing in the early 1950s, I find this unexpected. Here, Mascall is holding that the properly Catholic small c and big C view of nature and of grace does not allow for a completely separated, isolated, two-story or layer-cake analyses of the two orders. There is no anthropological dualism such as the orders of nature, the supernatural, which is not yet grace, properly speaking. These two are divorced. Rather, he says, and I quote him, supernature means the supernaturalization of nature, the elevation of a nature by grace to a condition that it could not attain by its own powers. And then he cites Thomas. Grace perfects nature without destroying, but also grace requires nature as its presupposition, the summa part 1. Now, Mascall does rely on the Thomistic notion of obediential potency to say that humanity by its nature, our nature, has a passive capacity for receiving divine grace. But at the same time, he does not want to advocate for a doctrine of pure nature, quote unquote, natura pura, from the late scholastic tradition. That is to say, that there ever was a purely natural man in the concrete order of reality. Hypothetical perhaps, but not in the concrete. And he goes on to argue that in history, God has elevated humans into an order of existence far surpassing rational animals of the Aristotelian system. We do have rational capacities and some ability to attain natural knowledge of God through our human reason. But in actual fact, historically, we have been elevated by God to our participation in God's own life. And he says, grace is thus not merely something added to nature, as an extra story may be added to a house. It is something that completes it and perfects it. Now this is all good and very earnest, but there is a point which I wonder if Mascall appears to be conflicted. On the one hand, he wants to, at least in the text that I've read, especially the Christ-like Christian, he wants to reject the later Thomistic pure nature theories, which sees grace as something that replaces nature. Yet he does seem to rely on obediential potency. That is, a power that can be actualized only by the gratuitous intervention of God, an obediential power that man desires God, and not because of his nature as human, being created human. And here I wonder if we have a problem. Mascall is clearly working with a source model from both the Augustinian and Eastern sources for a Thomist theology, yet he appears to neglect the doctrine of natural desire to see God. And so here, at the midway point in my remarks, I'd like to point out that the resource model of Mascall in the Anglophone sphere and the resource model of the French Jesuits in the Francophone world resemble strikingly similar projects with few points of interconnection on the face of it. But I do suggest that Mascall might benefit from the Dubaikian analysis of the supernatural, which relocates the emphasis not on grace, but in fact on the nature of nature, in which he deconstructs pure nature theory and focuses on the natural desire to see God, and does so by historical analysis. And this has been more thoroughly interrogated and corroborated by more contemporary French intellectual historians such as Montaigne, Benoit, and Jean-Yves Lacoste as recently as the 1990s. Bouverie grounds his argument for theological anthropology, which is a theology of nature, a theology of creation, in the eschatological destiny for human nature, for all dependent created beings, as indeed Mascall wants to do and uses that terminology. For Thomas Aquinas, Bouverie argues that it is true that every being attains its goal according to its nature. But man in the natural desire for the divine vision is a determination that belongs exclusively to his essence. On to Moller, question 5. And so, he says, every intellect naturally desires the vision of the divine substance, contra gentiles 3. And this desire can be satisfied. It can be satisfied because it is possible for the substance of God to be seen through the intermediary of the intellect, the intellectus, both by intellectual substances and by our souls. Again, the contra gentiles 3. So God thus raises up nature in the moment of creation in order to make it capable of receiving the vision of God, to be capax Dei. Our final goal, paradoxically, goes beyond the grasp of our nature. So man, therefore, for Thomas, has a paradoxical destiny on Dubak's version, which even surpasses the capacity in his nature. And the paradox of intellectual nature is to desire what it does not have power to acquire, to be able to attain through another a perfection that no creature can acquire by itself. And so this is the primus equivalent of question 5. And this poverty makes up the grandeur of our humanity, the presence of a supernatural which undergirds creation, which is not yet grace, increases the dignity of human nature. The natural desire to see God opens out onto a Christian humanism that opens out again onto a participation. Now, the difficulty with late scholastic theology is that it focused more on the study of nature than on the history of salvation, we all know, and thus it seemed to organize anthropology and to scrutinize this relationship between, on one hand, the nature of man, and on the other hand, the supernatural, which is not supernature, independently of that breach opened up by sin. This is the problem of pure nature that Mascall appears to equivocate on. I hope to be wrong, but I think that might be the case. In order to study the supernatural in its pure state, it was necessary to study nature before sin, as in Adam. And of course that's Cayetano, who reiterates the same separation between the orders, but in a novel way he inserts it into his commentary on Thompson. And de Lubac's broadside is that Cayetano, amongst others, introduces the hypothesis of pure nature in the name of an Aristotelian principle. Nature does nothing in vain. It cannot have, it may not have, an aspiration that would be unable to fulfill its own means. Hence, if there is in man a desire for God, this desire cannot be natural, but added on by God in a gratuitous act of his omniscience and his will. And that way the gratuity of God's grace is protected first and foremost. The doctrine of grace comes before any doctrine of creation or nature. De iuris, nature is self-sufficient, this is the theory of pure nature, and if de facto man always desires God, this is simply because God so wishes, because he substitutes himself in for the order of nature. Thus it is in virtue of an obediential power, a power that can be actualized, remember, only by the gratuitous intervention of God, that the human desires God, and not because of our nature as man created. And so Cayetano, the argument goes, makes possible both a humanism without God, it can subsist without the supernatural, and a theology imposed from outside, which is destructive of human nature. Now this set of questions and challenges they pose has been generally obscured, as we know, by neo-scholasticism, and the principal credit for bringing them to the fore lies with de Lubac, under the influence of Blondel, despite the violent opposition from the neo-Thomist critics. And he rediscovers a very old principle, which I think is one that is at the heart of Mascall's project, and I want to test this. If all of human nature is called to salvation, the divine gift acts within each one in virtue of their creation, in spite of original sin. The whole cosmos was created with a view to the recapitulation of all things in man and in Christ. The crucial upshot is this. In spite of original sin, every human spirit, baptized and unbaptized, is a nature that desires God, but can receive him only as a free and gratuitous gift of grace. In creation, in spite of the fall, God deposits the aspiration in nature itself. This desire is nothing other than its call. So I think in attending to this question of natural desire to see God might better account for what Mascall in fact very much wants to argue for. In spite of his reliance on obediential potency, however he might define it. I mean, he explains that the grace is a participation in the life of God, which is effected by incorporation into the human nature of Christ. For he does clearly argue that it is the essence of all finite beings to be incomplete, to be essentially open, to be open to grace, to the activity of God, who without subtracting or withdrawing anything given, is always able to complete and to perfect. This deification by grace requires the original gift of dependent creation, which is undergirded by the supernatural, in order to bring about a supernatural destiny. And so I think this is the final place where the source-law approaches of Mascall and Bouverie coincide, and to use Mascall's words from quite late. It is that grace not only supplies perfections that lie above the level of nature, but also restores nature to its own integrity. Gratis is sans, as well as elevans. Grace is healing, as well as elevating. It follows, therefore, that while in principle there is a certain limited knowledge of God which is accessible to the human reason as such, in practice, it is only in the light of revelation, under the assistance of grace, that human reason can function adequately and can obtain, even within its own proper sphere, a knowledge of God which is free from error. Philosophy and theology are thus in abstract autonomous, being concerned respectively with the sphere of reason in nature, and on the other hand, revelation and grace. But in concrete, he says, a true philosophy can only be developed in the light of the Christian revelation. So I think Mascall, like Bouverie following John Mill, wants to argue for a small c Catholic structure of all human nature and of philosophy or metaphysics, and its connection between theology and being, the universal truth of which reaches its fulfillment in accordance with and in light of the fullness of Christian revelation, yet it is prefigured in the form. Crucially, the two of them are developing this about the same time. On the one hand, an Anglo-Catholic, and on the other hand, a Roman Catholic theology of Catholicity, small c, which is qualitative in nature and is, common to both of them, inherently Capax Dei. And so, I conclude, perhaps the real genius of Mascall in this domain, in any event, is an implicit development for Anglophone theology of a neglected early theology of creation or nature, which yet still requires a second gift of grace, and the ordering of creation before the doctrine of grace, at least when we theologians are at work. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I have an ambitious title, The Ecclesiology of Edward Mascall, and like many ambitious titles in academic addresses, I'm going to refer to an extremely short text on which to focus my attention. A pamphlet that was published by the English Church Union in the year 1950, The Assumption of Our Lady, which contains two addresses. One, Bishop Mortimer of Exeter, delivered to his diocesan conference on the occasion of the definition of the dogma of the Assumption, and a conflation of two articles that Edward Mascall published in the church magazine, The Guardian, in 1950, which deal with his ecclesiological reflections on that definition, why he felt it was unsatisfactory, and how it fitted in with a critique, if you like, of the way in which contemporary Roman Catholic ecclesiology was developing, and which I think has some relevance also, which I will talk about as well, to the way in which the synodal process in the modern Roman Catholic Church is developing at the moment with regard to the discernment of doctrine and the possibility of doctrinal definition, consulting the faithful in matters of doctrine, and so on and so forth. Ecclesiology has, it seems to me, always been something of a problem for Anglo-Catholics. If you assert that the Church is a visible society, hierarchically ordered, with an authority to teach the truth about supernatural things, it is somewhat problematic if at the end of making that assertion you have to point to Randall Davidson or somebody and say, here it is, this is it, this is the conclusion of the process of revelation in that sense. Even though one chapter of Cosmo Lang's biography is entitled Alterius Orbis Papa, nevertheless that claim has not stuck as well as perhaps Lockhart thought when he first proposed it. So it is that Anglican Catholics have had to think about what it means to be the Church, what it means to think about the Church as having visible authority, and why the Church of England is as it is, if we are making the sort of claims about it and about Anglicanism that history and its settings necessarily make in the light of our history. I think probably one of the most successful attempts to do this comes through the influence of Hegel and idealism in Oxford in the 19th century, and I think that perhaps one of the most interesting hidden links, if you like, in the way that Anglican ecclesiology developed within the Catholic movement in the 19th century came out of the coincidence that Charles Gore was an undergraduate at Balliol College and therefore had the influence of Benjamin Jowett and the Oxford idealists. Jowett managed to domesticate Hegel to some degree. Ian Wilson, when he's writing about this period, notes that Jowett had a bust of Hegel put in the library at Balliol and announced when the bust was unveiled, "See, we've made him look quite a gentleman," indicating his reception into the pantheon of English respectability at the time. But I think that the Hegelian method of synthesis is extremely important for that generation of Anglo-Catholics at that time, for Gore and the Lux Mundi people. They were able to explain what were the evident shortcomings of Catholic influence and practice in the Church of England by seeing the tension in the Church as it was here and now as being a movement towards synthesis, just as the Roman Catholic Church emphasised certain points which were very important but were insufficient in itself in regard to comparisons with the Church of England. So the Church of England had an important role in moving towards that ultimate synthesis which would be the life of the Church triumphant in heaven. And we see this in a lot of the ecclesiology of that generation. There are certain choices and preferences. Kenotic Christology. If Jesus on earth didn't know who he was, why should we as the Church know exactly who we are as a visible Church? It's also the case that they had a preference for heavenly offering understandings of the Eucharist, that the Eucharist is consummated, if you like, in a heavenly offering. Though we should remember there that Mascall, of course, is very interested in the Eucharistic theology of Delatile, who talks about the heavenly offering in his great work in that respect. And there is also an embrace of the higher criticism in biblical studies. This does not always result in what you might call socially liberal conclusions. So, for example, Charles Gore said that it's not possible to prove the indissolubility of marriage from Scripture unless you take into account higher criticism, which enables you to exclude the Lutheran exception. So, liberal Catholicism, in that sense, an Hegelian idealistic project, I think does offer a kit bag of ecclesiology that was able to sustain many Anglican thinkers for a long period of time, at least until, as William Temple said and admitted, the arrival of logical positivism in Oxford and the collapse of that particular mentality of thought which was so important in Anglican theology and which is still continued in some respects by people like Andrew Shanks in our own time. For those who weren't able to embrace that particular Hegelian ecclesiology, there were a variety of other options, not all of which were particularly satisfactory. At the very beginning, there were still a few ecclesiastical coelacanths who were happy to continue with the old ways and considered the Pope as the Antichrist. I think the last person who, of a high church disposition, thought that was Bishop Wordsworth. I may be doing him an injustice. And of course, there are those who embrace the branch theory. That the church was made up of branches, that the branch proper to, well, essentially the British Empire was Anglicanism, that reunion talks with the Orthodox would be the best way of, in some respects, ganging up on the Roman Catholics and building a communion that was governed episcopally and was a clear, visible church in that sense. And we see signs of that in books like Vernon's States, The Catholic Religion. It's a good little catechetical book, but it contains, in its earlier editions, lists of bishops throughout the British Empire, indicating the growth of the Anglican Communion and its extension throughout the world in that sense. Intellectually, I think there is an underrated third way also in which Anglo-Catholics, particularly in the period between the wars, began to think about how the Anglican inheritance fitted into the Catholicity of the Church in the modern world. And we see a trend which is particularly associated actually, I think, with Oxford, but also which spreads a little throughout the Church of England, of seeing that everything went wrong in the 18th century. The most famous example of this, I think, are Leighton Cullen's Bantam Lectures, Religion Since the Reformation, in which he says that the objection that Anglicanism has to contemporary Roman Catholicism is to do with the substitution of the authority of St. Alphonsus de Liguori for that of St. Augustine and the rejection of the perennial doctrine of grace taught by Augustine at the time of Jansen's controversy, bull unigenitus, and so on and so forth. This may seem somewhat obscure, but Leighton Pullen's used to be able to get a copy of Leighton Pullen's Religion since the Reformation in nearly every second-hand theological bookshop, certainly about 30 or 40 years ago. It was recommended by people like Eric Kemp, who said it was a good book. It is a good book, an interesting book. And we see its influence in other places, and so we see it in Skinner's Synopsis of Moral and Pastoral Theology, which ceases to cite Roman Catholic authorities after the bull unigenitus. And we see it also in bigger projects as well, such as the translation of Purat's famous 4-volume History of Spirituality, which the SBCK had translated into English and published, but only the first 3 volumes. And so the SBCK considered that for Anglicans in the 1930s, that 17th century Spaniards, 16th century Spaniards and 17th century French divines were now acceptable, but that 18th century Italians, which constitute the 4th volume, were not. An interesting sideline, I think, the way that the line moved. I mean, we all now know, after Radical Orthodoxy, that everything went wrong with Duns Scotus, but there was the school of thought that did think it all went wrong with unigenitus in the 18th century. Anglo-Papalism stands counter to this, and Anglo-Papalism, I think, manifests itself in 2 ways. They're sort of, you know, the sort of ankle-biting crazies in parish priests who went out into sort of little respectable villages and turned them into sort of little Bavarian or French shrines, which Michael Yelton chronicles so well. Very often disappointed men as a consequence of the rejection of their work and the rather strange and melancholic corner of Anglican history, which Yelton describes very well. But there was also an intellectual Anglican papalism, in particular represented, I think, by really interesting works. The short work by Gregory Dix, Jurisdiction, Episcopal and Papal in the Early Church, which is a short couple of articles, I think he wrote for Laudate, about the way in which papal authority and episcopal authority developed together in the early church. And also, of course, the magisterial set of Langton lectures that Trevor Jalland published, The Church and the Papacy, which I think are of perennial value. Jalland knew his market, and he begins his Langton lectures with 2 bishops on a railway train, knowing the enthusiasm of the clergy for railways. It's a wonderful cinematic scene, actually. He begins the lectures, the bishops are on a train crossing the Roman Campagna. They've just left the First Vatican Council. They're French and they're inopportunists, and they're not going to vote against the infallibility, but they're not going to vote for it. And one of the bishops says to the other, "Nous avons fait une grande faute." You know, we've done the wrong thing. We should have stayed and voted. And the bishop opposite him, I think is Dupin, raises his finger to his lips to indicate that he started saying the breviary, and he's not going to respond. And then Jalland takes it on from there. And so an intellectual Anglo-Papalism was certainly something that was a very important part of the mix, if you like, at the time that Mascall was maturing as a theologian and was beginning to think about ecclesiological issues. Which brings us to the pamphlet that was published in 1950, to which I've made reference. I'm just going to have a glass of water on it. Thank you. In 1950, it became clear that Pope Pius XII was going to exercise formally, for the first time since the definition of papal infallibility in 1870, that power that had been defined in 1870 for the Roman Pontiff to define doctrine apart from a general council. And the Pope, after a great deal of consultation of the hierarchies of the world, and after much petitioning from various lay and clerical associations, decided that the dogma of the bodily assumption of the Blessed Virgin Mary was to be defined, and indeed it was in 1950. This definition caused a great deal of ecumenical consternation, and it also caused a great deal of heart-searching for Anglo-Catholics about how they were intending to react to it. And the reactions were very varied. Austin Farrer famously said that this was an example of the papal fact factory going full blast again. Very critical, obviously. Mascall tells in Saraband, by contrast, a university sermon that was preached in 1950 by somebody who was very much identified, he doesn't identify the person, who was an a modernist after the sort of fashion of Loisy and so forth, a very sort of typical modernist of that sort of French school, who caused absolute outrage by preaching a university sermon here by saying that the definition of the assumption was a very good thing because we could now believe in our Lord's ascension because the ascension had rested on flimsy scriptural evidence before then that nobody could take seriously. But now the visible church had defined the assumption our Lord must be in the same place as Our Lady ascended into heaven. Mascall's account of the outrage this caused is very amusing. The priest in question had no idea of the offence he caused and apparently said, well, if I denied the resurrection, they wouldn't have minded. Perhaps more typical is the reaction of the first lecture in here, the lecture that was made by Bishop Mortimer, in which he sort of really says that although devotionally speaking the assumption is quite a nice idea, it's not definable, and that the Church of England quite rightly should resist that. That was a fairly typical, moderate Anglo-Catholic approach to that. But Mascall, I think, in his description of why he objects to the doctrine is really rather more interesting and ingenious. And he makes 2 points, actually, but in particular one point that I will come on to shortly, which I think shows Mascall at his classically, not whimsical, but actually perhaps the mathematical side of Mascall when he talks about the assumption. So when he introduces his discussion of the definition of the assumption, he begins with an extremely clear assertion. He says, to accept the corporal assumption as true seems to me to be a matter of common sense and ordinary humility for anyone who is conscious of his solidarity with the whole Catholic Church of the ages. To deny it categorically, for there is no positive evidence against it, seems to me to be an act of singular intellectual self-assertion. And I would suggest that Anglican theologians ought to consider more seriously than they have considered up to the present time the status of a doctrine which has required this kind of universal acceptance. So rather unlike those theologians who were saying that the definition of the doctrine was really a luxury, Mascall is saying that to deny it is in fact to go against the entire weight of Catholic opinion on this question. He's also very sympathetic about the way the doctrine was actually defined, the terms of it. As the Pope said, we pronounce, declare and define that it is a dogma divinely revealed that the Immaculate Mother of God, Mary ever Virgin, after the course of her earthly life was completed, was assumed in body and soul into the heavenly glory. Mascall says that if a definition were to be made, it could not be made in a better way. And he goes on to make 2 very speculative assertions, which I do think are worth recording as very characteristic of him. Firstly, he says that the definition does not exclude the fact that Our Lady may have died, that her body may have decomposed in the normal way, and then subsequently, in some secret way of which we could not be physically aware, such as remained after the process of decomposition was taken up by God and removed from the material world. He says that that's compatible to believe that and believe in the definition of 1950. Secondly, and more ingeniously, he says that the problem that is often adduced for not defining the assumption, that is that the stories describing the assumption don't emerge in the Christian tradition until about the year 405, or until the year 400 or so, is to say that the assumption took place 400 years after Mary's death. He says that there is nothing in the definition that would prevent you from believing that, and asserts that that's a possibility. I think that that's Mascall as his least historical and most mathematical, if you like, in that way. But I do think it's quite an amusing point, I say, an amusing point. It's quite an interesting speculative point that he was prepared to root around rather within the definition to talk about why he felt that it actually was not such a problem in and of itself with regard to the doctrine, in the way that some other people had felt. He certainly doesn't think it's an example of the papal fact factory going full blast, as Austin Farrow described it. But what Mascall objects to is the way in which the definition presumes to say that the assumption is part of the deposit of faith, the full deposit of faith. And he takes us, classically, as Mascall very often does, takes us as interlocutor, the very exotically named Count Michael de la Bédoyère, who, despite having that exotic moniker, was in fact the grandson of Bishop Farrell of Rochester, and was the editor of the Catholic Herald at the time. He quotes de la Bédoyère as saying, "If we hold, as every Catholic must obviously hold, that the Church is guided at all times by the Holy Spirit, then how better account for the slow but steady growth of this belief on theological rather than evidential grounds, save by the action of the Holy Spirit within the Church? And once the doctrine was universally accepted within the Church as true, we reached the stage when the Church, which cannot err in holding as true a fact of theological and doctrinal order, has come to hold the doctrine of the Assumption as true in this sense. As such, the Church cannot err in doing so. Granted all this, the step from holding the doctrine as true by church authority to holding it as true by divine teaching, in that the doctrine was contained at least implicitly but precisely in the original deposit of faith, is an easy one, awaiting only the infallible proclamation of the Vicar of Christ." To which Mascall replies, to put it briefly, well, up to a point, Count Copper. It's clear that de la Bédoyère's assertion reflects a particular theological understanding of what was present in the deposit of faith that Mascall criticises, which is the idea that something can be contained implicitly within the deposit of faith rather than explicitly. And Mascall is very critical about that point. It's very clear, I think, from those theologians, I think probably the most substantive and remarkable ecclesiologist of the period was probably Charles Rouenet, the Swiss theologian, whose magisterial book on the Church is still very well worth reading. But he certainly asserts quite strongly this idea that there are implicit formal content of the deposit of faith, which is patient with further definition. And it's that to which Mascall objects. Mascall says that this completely inverts the normal process of thinking about how the Church can decide and teach reliably what is to be taught. He says that it makes the argument run like this. This truth is going to be defined anyhow, and so it must be definable. All definable truths are contained in the deposit of faith. Therefore, this truth is contained in the deposit of faith. And so, if it is not contained explicitly, it must be contained implicitly. And Mascall says that that really is the failing about the definition of the assumption, and also the failing of those theologians and ecclesiologists that wish to assert that one can detect, as it were, what is present within the deposit of faith implicitly, essentially by a method of polling and authority contained in the papal office. Now, I make that point and come back to Mascall, not really simply for antiquarian interest, because I think it does have some significant bearing on the way in which the process of discerning the truth to be taught is operating at the moment through the synodal process in the Roman Catholic Church. It's evident that the method of synodality, which is a new one and one which is not entirely fleshed out, seems to me to rely quite heavily on the idea of an implicit sense of what is contained within the deposit of faith, and the way in which that implicit deposit can be apprehended and defined in our own age. And it seems to me also in the very recent document at Theologiam Promovendum that the Pope has recently issued, talking about the way in which theological method is to be conducted in the principal Roman theological seminaries, is to move away from a propositional form of theology towards a more inductive and contextual one, the Oxford NTH appears again. And I think that Mascall's criticism, therefore, is a pertinent one and a realistic one to put to that confidence in the capacity of the Church to define simply by polling and consultation the way in which doctrine arrives. Obviously, the setting in which the Roman Catholic Church finds itself at the moment in this exercise of synodality is a very different sort of setting, with rather different sorts of conclusions being drawn than were in 1950. But we might say that they are two sides of the same coin, and that Mascall's critique in 1950 has something to say to us at the time now. Thank you.
As in previous sessions, can you hear me? As in previous sessions, we're going to have a roving mic coming around for you to ask questions, make comments, pose counter-arguments, etc. If you'd like to kick us off, please raise your hand and my colleague Tim will come and find you and let you pose a question. In which case, I might abuse my privilege and start off by drawing on a common theme which also connected with Father Christopher Smith's lecture last night. So, Father Philip, you touched on the importance of Mascall having an eschatological doctrine of man or of human being, and Father Robin, you noted Mascall's affinity with heavenly offering understanding of the Eucharist, of his willingness to entertain that. And it made me think in particular of Father Christopher dwelling at length on Mascall's preoccupation with the Chalcedonian definition, kind of at the centre of the intersection, unsurprisingly, of his anthropology and his Christology. So I just wondered if the two of you might comment on the Chalcedonian Christological centre to what seems to be Mascall's theological anthropology, and perhaps feed that back into what you both said. I don't know if that's live, if you want to try it. It wasn't simple.
I think I mean, you might look at his enthusiasm for the doctrine of the Assumption. I mean, of course, everyone who does patristics in Oxford, was sent the Henry Chadwick article from 1950 when he writes about Nestorian Christology, doesn't he? It's a sort of slightly oblique, a sort of critique of the Assumption definition. He writes in the Journal of Theological Studies about the relationship between Cyrilline Christology, a high doctrine of the Eucharist, and Nestorian understandings of the Eucharist. And it finishes, as the last sentence of the article mentions, suddenly, then strange stories began to circulate about what had happened to the Mother of God after she died. And so I think that there is a connection there, and I think that Mascall's Chalcedonian Christology does enforce the fact that he's very positive about the doctrine of the Assumption in 1950, but makes these, I think, pertinent and important ecclesiological points about how far one can rely on teaching that is implicit within the deposit of faith.
Thank you, Robin. Yeah, John, I think I would just perhaps refer to what Father Christopher may have said, is that if you have a theological anthropology according to Mascall, it has to in some way begin with the human person created in the Imago Dei, which is intimately connected with the Chalcedonian Christology. Because I also think, and this is the second part of the story, that there's a big place in the eschatology of Mascall for the beatification. I think glory is a very important theme for him. And that theme is very important because he sees this Imago Dei within the human spirit, not a mind, a soul-body split, but a tripartite anthropology, spirit, soul, and body. And in fact, the dynamism that I referred to before is in fact, that image is the image of the Trinity. And I think he has that in mind. And so you can't get anywhere without that Chalcedonian base. I mean, I want to thank you for putting this idea in my mind, because I've learned so much about Mascall in the last 4 weeks, and I'm going to force some of my students to read it as well, because he really does have a very good systematic grasp of the doctrinal teaching of the Church. But he can also articulate between those very important ontological, philosophical questions, which of course were deeply out of fashion in his time and afterwards. And so I think that they're ripe for excavation today.
Got a hand up from you in the front here.
This is a slightly cheeky question. I would like to know, Father Moller, if you agree with Father Moller's take on Mascall and Bouverie.
If I,
Do you agree with your compatriot on that?
I'm afraid I'm an incorrigible pure nature person, and I'm also an incorrigible unbeliever in the heavenly offering, so I probably don't have very much to say positively about those two aspects of Mascall's thought in that way.
So do you think Mascall would have been on the back end and an opponent of yours?
Yeah, I think he probably would have been.
From Bishop Road.
Thank you. I wonder if I can ask a brief question of both speakers. Is that allowed?
Yes, encouraged.
First of all, to Philip, I take very much what you say about the slight ambivalence that Mascall shows on pura natura in certain aspects. But it seems to me that the crucial thing, and this is a bit of a spoiler for what I want to say later on, the crucial thing is, he says we cannot imagine any finite agent that is not uninterruptedly activated by infinite divine action. In other words, there is never a finite reality that is independent in that sense. But that action is always, of course, characterized by grace. So there's never any way of driving a wedge between the creature, divine action, and really never any absolute way of driving a wedge between the action of God to create and the action of God to redeem. Of course, we split it up for all sorts of purposes. But I think that there is a sort of ontological thing about the nature of creation as activated by God, which is at the root of this. We just sort of heave the style of it onto the Bouverie side. Does that make sense? But before I shut up, just a quick question to Robin. Some of these discussions about Anglo-Catholicism and about the implicit character of newly revealed doctrine, these of course were being discussed at Malines in the early 1920s. B.J. Kidd of Keble mounts a very sophisticated version of the sort of Anglo-Catholicism, which says, it's an unhappy mistake that a couple of administrative errors in the 16th century separated the Church of England into two provinces, Canterbury and York, from the rest of Catholic Christendom. But hey, that's just a point of detail. At the same time, Gall mounts a very strong case against what you might call implicitism in his later interventions. Did Mascall read any of that, do you know? Does anybody know?
On the point of fact, I don't know, but I mean, it would seem to me that the sophistication of his consideration of the issues in hand would make me think that he would be aware of a sort of range of opinions, and in particular, the Diggs and the Jannon pieces. I think in particular, and I'm sure he must have read and thought about those because they were happening around him. I think in that sense, yeah. But as to the Malines stuff, I have no idea. I mean, he was a great man for these groups, wasn't he? Christendom and all of those things. He liked that method of working, I think, and so I don't know. He was never formally part of it, I think, but I'm sure that he was, yeah.
The records have been published.
Yes, indeed, yeah.
And to the point of human nature, look, I think that's a really helpful connection because what I haven't done, correction, is gone back and seen precisely how Mascall will interpret that obediential potency question. And so, as you all know, it's highly contested across the commentators as to what the content of this means. And I know this sounds very strange, but how passive is passivity? That sounds like a double negative, but if one is created by grace and activated by grace, is there still some receptivity in that passivity? And I'd be very interested to see, because I'm sure as a careful thinker, Mascall has talked about that, where that is. So I think that's a very important correct. So thank you.
Can we have an interjection from Father Christopher?
Well, there's a parent, like you're talking about chapter 4 of the Unity, aren't you, there? And he talks about grace as being a quality of the soul at some point in there. So I would like to give one of useful points back.
And then Peter, yeah, please.
Just on that, I think, if I'm aware, I think it's in the importance of being human. But Mascall does develop precisely this sense that actually the law of contingent being is constantly energized and held in being by the continuing act of God. But there is a degree to which the soul can cooperate in that reception, and the degree to which grace, the nature of the individual is perfected by grace, is at least in part to do with one's cooperation with the action. So I think there's some of that in there.
So, hand over there.
Thank you for your contributions. I hadn't read that pamphlet by Mascall on the Assumption, and it's obviously something I must go back to read. Just 2 or 3 little observations. The first is just to say I did organise once a symposium on the Malines conversations, at which Mascall was present, and therefore I would assume that he had actually read quite a lot of the documents that went in it, and the idea of being in fact united but not absorbed was something that he was very keen to develop. Just to say, I think it's important, reading through Mascall and my experience of him, that we allow him to develop. And although, I mean, just a personal level, right at the in old age, when he was at Seaford, I used to go down and read to him. And like an old man, and he had a great big beard, a bit like Moses, I think, with a great big white beard. You carefully make sure, because he was old, that if you mentioned something he either didn't want to talk about, he would say, I can't remember what I wrote then. I remember talking to him about the search for unity and whether he'd revise it. But one thing I noticed that he did revise, and a classic example is Corpus Christi, where there is both the first and second version. And there are quite contrasts in that, which allowed him to develop his understanding of Eucharistic theology. I can remember also again my time at King's, because all those documents were coming out during the Second Vatican Council. Well, one day we went in for a symposium, and he actually had a birthday cake. And the reason he had a birthday cake was because the document had just come out on the church. And he said this in humility, not in arrogance, but he was very excited because the Catholic Church was now saying the things about Our Lady that he himself had said 20, 30 years previously. And so, I mean, in that context, of course, there is reference to the Assumption.
Yeah, if I might just say very briefly in response to that, I mean, I do think that Mascall, in this very short thing, actually responds in a way, I think generally the sort of establishment Anglo-Catholic view of responding to the Assumption definition in 1950 was sort of along the lines that, oh, the excitable foreigners have let us down again. It was a bit like that, actually, why can't they just have, be restrained and, not go around defining dogmas and sing Oh Highly Favoured Lady and all that sort of stuff, and just keep it, and I think Mascall's piece on this is actually very, very, very sparky and stimulating, really, even though in the end he comes down on the side of saying that the definition of the doctrine was a mistake, but he does so in a way which I think is actually a useful engagement with the broader tradition. Again, comes back to this theme that Mascall actually was not constrained in so many ways by a narrow Church of Englandism.
A question for Canon Ward about kind of the way that Anglo-Catholics have tended to treat history. Often, many have accused Anglo-Catholics of having quite a, should we say, speculative view of history, pointing to certain things which may or may not be Catholic in the history of the Church of England. Do you think Mascall, in some sense, almost rises above this kind of, this level of argumentation where Anglo-Catholics can point to, we don't need to point to kind of periods in our history when we perhaps have a more reformed view, of certain things, but they would try and say, well, no, actually it was quite Catholic. Do you think in some sense he kind of raises himself, I've noticed this in the article about the Assumption, does he almost sort of raise himself above this intellectual, some may say dishonesty?
Well, yeah, Brian Horn, who I think you knew Mascall well at King, said that Mascall's principal limitation is he had no historical imagination whatsoever. Which I mean, I have no idea whether that's the case or not, whether that's doing him a great wrong. But when I was talking to Brian about Mascall, that was one of the things that he said. He just didn't really have that very particular, perspective that Anglo-Catholics tend to think in that rather historical way. But which Mascall didn't. So yeah, I mean, I think that yes, I think that is the case. Yeah. If I could just come back to that very briefly. In the memoirs of Joseph Ratzinger that were published in sort of interview form, he was quite interesting when he was saying he was at seminary, I think in 1950, when the definition was going through, and he was talking about the way in which he had to come to terms with the fact, rather like what Mascall is saying here, that there are historical problems about saying that this is formally part of the deposit of faith. Even though there is going to be a definition. And he talks about how his seminary professors were rather divided about the opportuneness of the definition, or even its possibility, or really its opportuneness. And Ratzinger is quite interesting about how he personally came to terms with understanding how he felt that the consensus of the Church could, as it were, draw out of this implicit sense of the deposit of faith, a truth that could be defined in this way at that time.
I was just going to pick up on the issue of development and nature and grace debate. It's interesting that Fergus Kerr describes Mascall's views in Via Media as being the best summary of the debate in the Roman Catholic Church on the subject. But Mascall himself draws fondly on the conference he went to, which involved the Roman Catholics, some Anglicans, and Orthodox, and on the Protestant side, as he put it, members of the Reformed tradition. He was rather sad that the Lutherans weren't present as well. But it's worth saying that his views on nature and grace embraced particularly the Orthodox understanding of grace and the Orthodox criticisms of the Catholic tradition, both Roman Catholic and Protestant. And from that, though, during that, there was a meeting of minds, a drawing together on the subject of nature and grace. And what he's doing, I think, is seeking to express that shared understanding that they came to then. He goes back to that at the end of the Gifford lectures in the appendix, interestingly. And he also devotes a lecture which is in Nature and Supernature, when he was giving the 3 earlier lectures, which actually is a brilliant summary of his thinking at that stage, some 15 years plus later. So there is this sense of ongoing understanding, but also that sense of comprehensiveness, I think. Does that fit with what you think of?
Definitely, I'm very pleased that you've raised that, because in preparation for this, I looked at the years precisely that he was in Oxford, and I went and begged the archivist of Campion Hall to go and dig in the visitors' books. And after some slight rumbling, came back, and we went through 6 years from the 40s to the early 50s, and he was meeting with the then master of Campion Hall, Martin Darcy, himself, as you know, was a systematic theologian. And Darcy was one of the first people to receive and read sort of the very poor quality French prints that were coming after the war out of France. And he, together with a Dominican called Victor White from Blackfriars, were doing this as well. And it would be beyond my imagination to think they did not discuss these very important topics together, each from their own perspectives, which I think I think for them was be a very, very ecumenical undertaking, not least within the Jesuits. But I think the point is that there was a deep sensitivity at this really important time to see that the apologetics at the time in the First and the Second World War and the doctors of nature and grace, at least in Roman Catholic form, had profoundly failed. They'd failed to prevent the destruction and the death of the two wars, and they'd failed to prevent the Holocaust. So I can't imagine those kinds of things were not profoundly being discussed, and they're much better synthesized by the time you get to the Giffords, which I found very helpful. But for my own learning, I wanted to see what his early positions were and if he had changed or not, which I'm sure he did, but I'll get back to that one.
We have some time for more questions, which can also encompass the previous sessions. If you would like to, like Jarrett's pupils, be good Hegelians and synthesize across different discussions we've had so far. I have one minor question on that theme, which both of you might be able to answer, which is to do with Mascall's attitude to the deposit of faith. Simply because listening to Michael Lloyd's talk yesterday, talking about Mascall's angelology, I was struck by how incredibly creative a theologian he was in terms of his sources, and in particular his use of apocryphal Jewish texts to construct his angelology. You know, of all the people that I might have imagined relying on Second Enoch and Jubilees to construct a sort of Thomistic angelology, I don't know. That's a failure of the imagination on my part, that I didn't foresee that Mascall would be doing that. To me, and for anyone who doesn't know me, I'm very much not a 20th century theologian, so I'm asking this question out of ignorance, but that to me seems surprising. And reflects, to my mind, an odd view of the deposit of faith, contrasting with the slightly more conservative approach that he takes with regards to the definition. Don't know if you did you know much about his attitude to extra scriptural sources, or is that an area where, because it seems to contrast slightly with what we were saying about him not having a particularly historical imagination, and yet he seems to be willing to reach into Jewish antiquity to pluck out the foundations of an angelology.
What was the quote that we heard? Was it this morning? Was it from you, Mother Lucy? The one about him saying that we had the deposit of faith and we knew very little. Could we read that to us again? I mean, that I thought that was a really. Sorry, I'm not taking over. You're in charge. No. You've got the microphone. It was just, I thought that quote really addressed that bit.
I think this is the one you mean from. So this was from Theology in the Gospel of Christ. The Church's tradition is a great and living inheritance of thought and life, most of whose content has hitherto been undisturbed, and most of whose potentialities have hitherto been unactualized. It is by bringing this great living inheritance into impact upon the world in which we live that our task towards that world will be achieved. That's the one you meant?
Yeah, that's exactly it. I almost abandoned this talk, actually, after having heard him say that, because I thought that really just actually undermines everything he says. But yes.
Do you want to let Lucy?
I think that then echoes a question which I was thinking, which was, one could ask it either in the historical way, which was, what was then going on as the Church was in other ages discerning what the deposit of faith is and contains? Or one could put it the other way and say, what does Mascall think the Pope should have done? You see, there are two different ways of asking the same question.
I imagine Mascall probably thought the Pope should be a very elderly gentleman living in Rome whose name is mentioned in every Eucharistic prayer every time the Eucharist is celebrated. I think that probably would have been sort of the ideal. I probably think that's the ideal. So Well, I just think that there is such a distance between those two quotations, really. It's just very interesting, the tension between those two positions about his concern here about the discernment of things that are implicit, and his statement that actually nearly everything is implicit, and we've still got to get on with getting it out. I don't know how he resolves that. Sorry.
Father Robin.
But I think that is then the question about process. It's not that it's not there, it's what do you do about it.
But that's why I think the synodal process is very interesting in that respect.
Father Robin, that was my sort of question I wanted to put to you, having heard what you said. You said, Mascall was a highly speculative thinker, and then Mother Lucy's given us that quote. Do you think in his speculation that Mascall thinks that doctrine can and must develop? And how would he articulate that? He was talking to the Romans and also to his own community. Or is that too difficult?
I think he would have certainly accepted a doctrine of development, yes, certainly, but I don't think he would have seen it as resulting, or certainly in 1950, that was his answer to it. Yeah, but he didn't think, not in that way. Yeah.
I think Father Yaroslav has a...
Hopefully not entirely unrelated, Father Robin, but as we were talking about the doctrine of the Assumption, popped into my mind that almost throwaway comment from Mascall in the beginning of Corpus Christi about why he rejects the papacy, because it's a result of a political rather than sacramental process, it's election rather than sacramental. Is there something of that in his dislike of an implicit doctrine, in the sense that it's not sacramental, it's not free gift, it's not graceful, in that sense the church is working too hard in mining the deposit of faith, rather than freely and happily accepting what is there?
Is that in both editions of Corpus Christi? I can't recall.
I don't know, I do not read books that carefully.
I'm sure you did. That was my experience. Well, I think it's very interesting that you said that, because I do think that Dix's that seminal thing on jurisdiction, paper and episcopal in the early church, actually is an answer to that question that he must have been aware of. So I'm surprised that he stated it quite so glibly, actually. I'd be interested to go and see how he's done it. Because Dix in his argument says, there's no point looking for universal ordinary jurisdiction in the first 3 centuries for the Pope, because nobody had what we would understand as the exercise of ordinary universal jurisdiction in the way that it's developed in canon law. But if you're looking for the way in which the Church patterns herself, Irenaeus talking about the Church that presides in love at Rome and so on and so forth, you can see, according to Dix, that primacy that is there from the start, and Jallan talks about that as well. So I'm surprised that Mascall puts it like that. Thank you.
It's a slightly more serious branch of my question, this time to you, Father. It doesn't seem to me, but I would appreciate it if you correct me if I'm wrong, that there's a break between an early and a late Mascall. And early Mascall was very happy to work with Gary Macron, with Descartes, with all sorts of people who, in the Louvain debate, will become the reactionary or the outvoted opponents. So I suppose my question is, if we take taking the line we've taken on Mascall and the Louvain and natural desire, is there a reason beyond the political, that this is a great break for Catholic interlocutors, Roman Catholic interlocutors, but does not seem to be such a break for Mascall, given that he's quite happy to draw on both sides of that controversy, or figures who become polarised in that controversy, from early on then, and to the best of my understanding, later as well. So, if it's a vital thing, and it's a big break on one side, why is it not such a break for Mascall?
I think for a couple of reasons. The first one is his deep reading of Eastern theology, which is not the case for Epiphany de God, for example, in any way, shape or form. But Mascall, I think, an Anglican theologian and someone at Christ Church, had a lot more academic freedom in many ways to express himself and to see where that goes. Because remember, for these sort of this high, and in de Kock's case, really Swaresian kind of Emmanuelist, the fixity and the staticness of the form was intimately related to the authority of the Roman Catholic Church. And so there could not be any kind of philosophical or methodological variations, lest that upset the deep authority of the Holy Father himself, but most importantly in things like the 24 Theses of Pius X, and then lastly the Catholic Church's, the Roman Catholic Church's moral theology. And I think that the openness and the availability of Mascall to choose different traditions, different Thomistic commentators in many ways, I don't think he was bound in the same way by the Emmanuels as the Roman Catholics. So I think it's an exercise of authority. And the second thing is, he wasn't teaching in a seminary. I remember Gallagher-Blanche was, de Kock was down in Lyon, sort of in Jersey, and then in Lyon for the year after that. And so I think that as a freedom, as an Anglican theologian, could be far more creative and introduce these ideas when the rest of the French Jesuits were basically censored and sent to the French equivalent of Siberia. That never happened to Mascall. So I want to say that that begins to approach your question. He had the freedom to do it, but he had the perspicacity. I mean, he was onto these things. And I don't want to say that he was influenced by the French Jesuits. He may have been doing it by himself. And I don't know enough of the archival work and the referencing, apart from what he puts in the bibliography, to say why. For example, on the Important Christ book, he only has the 1938 Catholicisme book. But he may have read the French articles that go into Supernatural, which appeared in the 1930s. That's the kind of granular detail that I would have to go into to give you an answer that you would be happy with. We just did it on purpose.
Any further questions? I think on that note, we may thank our speakers and head over for a coffee in the Simcross Common Room. The final session today will be Bishop Rowan's plenary lecture, so we'll be back in here for a 4 o'clock start sharp. Thank you very much.